The morning sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I knelt in the rich, loamy soil, pressing the last of my heirloom tomato seedlings into their new home. Dirt embedded beneath my fingernails, a badge of honor after 15 years of sterile conference rooms and 80-hour weeks at my law firm. The garden had become my sanctuary, each plant a small rebellion against the meticulously ordered life I'd left behind. I smoothed the soil around the delicate stem, unaware that this simple act of creation would soon ignite a neighborhood war that would expose decades of corruption and unearth secrets buried deeper than any root system. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" The voice sliced through the peaceful morning like a paper cut. I looked up, squinting against the sunlight to see Nancy Williams standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed over her designer blouse, her highlighted hair unnaturally still in the spring breeze. Her lips had compressed into a bloodless line of disapproval. "Good morning, Nancy," I said, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her gaze swept across the cedar-raised beds that now lined my driveway, filled with dark, nutrient-rich soil and carefully labeled rows of vegetables. Nothing that could possibly offend anyone with functioning taste buds. "This is completely unacceptable, James," she snapped. "Front yards in Willow Creek estates must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards, hidden from view. This isn't some rural farmstead." I rose slowly, suddenly conscious of my soil-stained jeans and worn t-shirt against her immaculate appearance. In the 5 years since Nancy had seized control of our homeowners association, our once friendly neighborhood had transformed into a battleground of arbitrary rules and surprise fines. Community cookouts had given way to certified letters, neighborly waves replaced by whispered warnings. "Nancy, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years, I said, keeping my voice level. "I have grandfather exemptions on most of these rules." "That's not how it works," she replied, producing her phone with practiced efficiency. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." Two neighbors walking their dogs slowed their pace, drawn to the confrontation like spectators to a traffic accident. Mrs. Peterson, who'd lived here since before the streets had names, offered me a sympathetic glance, while Mr. Thompson suddenly developed an intense fascination with a nearby maple tree. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," I continued, "and I've kept all correspondence with the previous board acknowledging my exemption. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She dismissed me with a flick of her manicured hand. "Save it for the hearing. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation by tomorrow. I suggest you remove all this." She gestured vaguely at my garden. "Mess before fines begin accumulating." As she marched away, her heels clicking a military cadence on the sidewalk, I noticed Mr. Jenkins from across the street watching from behind his curtains. He'd had his own run-in with Nancy last month over the color of his new mailbox. Apparently forest green wasn't the same as the approved hunter green, a distinction visible only to those with Nancy's peculiar brand of suburban omniscience. That evening, true to her word, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. $53 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was removed from my front yard. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I took the notice inside and added it to my growing file labeled HOA nonsense. But something about this felt different, more targeted, more personal. As if Nancy had been waiting for an excuse. My phone rang. It was Eleanor Ramos, the sweet elderly woman who'd lived down the street since before the development even had a name. "James, dear," her voice crackled through the phone, fragile but determined. "I saw Nancy harassing you this morning. You're not the first, you know. Last month she had the board fine the Thompsons $500 because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the architectural aesthetic of the neighborhood." My stomach tightened. "That can't be legal." "It wasn't," Eleanor confirmed. "But the Thompsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and painted the ramp. Nancy's been getting bolder since her friend Robert became the HOA's lawyer." Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about the Thompsons, forced to paint their daughter's wheelchair ramp to satisfy Nancy's aesthetic sensibilities. How many others had she bullied into compliance? How many had simply surrendered rather than fight? The next morning, I decided to do some research before heading to work. My family had owned much of this land before selling to developers in the 1970s. I remembered my father mentioning something about retaining certain rights, but I'd never paid much attention. I was digging through dusty boxes in my attic, searching for the original property documents, when I heard engines outside. heavy engines that didn't belong on our quiet residential street. Rushing to my front window, I froze at the scene unfolding in my driveway. 3 massive bulldozers blocked my car like mechanical sentinels, their yellow paint gleaming in the morning light. Nancy stood beside them in a crisp pantsuit, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed my phone and the folder of HOA documents. Whatever game Nancy was playing, she had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. As I stepped onto my front porch, Nancy's face lit up with a triumphant smile that sent ice water coursing through my veins. The bulldozer operators sat in their cabs, engines idling with predatory patience. "James Anderson," Nancy called out, her voice pitched to carry to the growing audience. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe that immediate action has been authorized." The man beside her stepped forward, adjusting his silk tie. "I'm Robert Taylor, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA. These," he gestured to my garden beds with manicured disdain, "unauthorized structures are being removed under Section 8.3 of the bylaws. Immediate remedy for public nuisance." My neighbors watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in shock. The Henderson kids stopped their bikes to stare, sensing the adult tension without fully understanding its source. I walked calmly down my front steps, mind racing through legal precedents and property statutes. I needed to stall while I formulated a strategy. "Mr. Taylor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you might want to check your legal footing here. Those aren't structures, they're temporary garden beds. And more importantly, you're about to make a very, very expensive mistake." Robert's smile faltered slightly, a hairline crack in his professional veneer. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Anderson. We have the full authority of the HOA covenant." Nancy stepped forward, practically vibrating with authority. "James, this stubbornness is so unnecessary. Just agree to remove the eyesores, pay the accumulated fines, which are now up to $300, and we can all move on." The bulldozer engines revved louder, a mechanical growl that seemed to shake the very air. The operator of the closest machine looked uncomfortable, glancing between me and Nancy with growing uncertainty. I pulled out my phone. "Before you proceed, I should probably let you know that I'm recording this, and I've just texted my associate at the firm to join us. Oh, and you should probably know something else about this property." Nancy rolled her eyes dramatically. "Save the legal mumbo-jumbo, James. Nothing you say will stop this." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The neighbors parted as Sheriff Martinez stepped out, followed by a woman carrying what looked like official county records. The sheriff moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had seen every variety of human conflict and found most of it tedious. Nancy's face cycled through confusion, then concern. "What's going on? We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter." I smiled for the first time that morning, feeling the weight shift in my favor. "Nancy, I don't think you understand exactly whose driveway you've blocked. And you definitely don't know whose land your bulldozers are parked on right now." The county clerk, Miss Abernathy, struggled with the weight of the large property maps as she spread them across the hood of the sheriff's car. Neighbors inched closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of public confrontation. The bulldozer operators had cut their engines, clearly sensing the shift in power. "These are the original survey maps from 1973, Miss Abernathy explained, pointing to the yellowed documents with a pencil. "And this is the property sale agreement between the Anderson family and Willow Creek Development Corporation." Nancy pushed forward, her confidence visibly wavering like a flame in a draft. "This is ridiculous. Whatever ancient paperwork you've dug up can't override our HOA authority." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you listen carefully to what Miss Abernathy is about to explain." The county clerk adjusted her glasses, relishing her moment in the spotlight. "According to these records, when the Anderson family sold this land for development, they retained specific rights. First, the mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development. Her finger traced the boundaries that encompassed our entire neighborhood. Second, all utility easements running under the main roads. And third, most importantly, explicit exemptions from any future homeowners associations for the 5 properties they kept for family members." I stepped forward, my house being one of those 5 properties. Robert Taylor frantically flipped through papers in his briefcase, legal training battling with dawning realization. "That's impossible," he sputtered. The HOA covenant applies to all properties within the development. There's no mention of exemptions. Miss Abernathy smiled patiently. That's because your HOA was formed in 1995, Mr. Taylor. These agreements were registered with the county in 1973. Your covenant cannot override pre-existing legal arrangements. Nancy's face had turned an alarming shade of red, as if all her carefully controlled rage had suddenly rushed to the surface. This is some kind of trick. Even if James's house has some special status, he still can't violate basic community standards. Actually, Sheriff Martinez interjected, his voice carrying the weight of county authority. According to county law, he can do whatever he wants with his property, as long as it doesn't violate county zoning regulations. And vegetable gardens are perfectly legal in residential zones. The crowd had grown larger, neighbors texting others to come witness the showdown. I noticed Mr. Jenkins recording everything on his phone, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. Nancy turned to the bulldozer operators, desperation edging into her voice. This changes nothing. Proceed with removal as planned. The lead operator shook his head, removing his hard hat. Sorry, ma'am. I'm not risking my license on disputed property, not without a court order. I'll get one, Nancy snapped. Today. I stepped closer to Nancy and Robert, lowering my voice so only they could hear. There's something else you should know. Those bulldozers are currently parked on an easement that, according to these documents, belongs to me. That's trespassing on private property. And since you brought them here with clear intent to damage my property, I let the implication hang in the air, between us like smoke. Robert grabbed Nancy's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened with something that looked remarkably like fear, an emotion I'd never associated with Nancy Williams. Sheriff, I said calmly, I'd like to file a report for attempted property damage and trespassing. Sheriff Martinez nodded. We can take care of that right now. This is outrageous. Nancy exploded, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. The HOA has governed this neighborhood for decades. You can't just suddenly claim special privileges. It's not sudden, Nancy, came a frail voice from the crowd. Eleanor Ramos made her way forward, leaning heavily on her cane, her 82 years doing nothing to diminish the steel in her spine. Some of us have known about the Anderson exemptions all along. The old board respected them, but when you took over, Nancy glared at Eleanor, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. Stay out of this. Your Christmas decorations violation hearing is next week. Or have you forgotten? Several neighbors gasped at Nancy's open threat to the beloved widow. The balance of public opinion, already tilting against Nancy, now shifted decisively. Eleanor smiled sweetly. Oh, I haven't forgotten anything, dear. In fact, my memory is quite excellent. I remember when your husband built that shed 2 feet over the Johnson property line, and when you had Robert here dismiss the violation because, what was it again? Administrative discretion. The crowd began to murmur more loudly, the collective whispers building like an approaching storm. Nancy's face flushed deeper as she looked around at the growing number of hostile faces. Robert Taylor checked his watch nervously. Nancy, we should continue this discussion in private. Perhaps we could schedule a proper hearing. There will be no hearing, I interrupted. My property is exempt from your authority. Those bulldozers need to be removed from my easement immediately, or I'll add additional charges to my complaint. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Folks, let's keep things civil. Miss Williams, Mr. Taylor, I suggest you direct these operators to remove their equipment. Mr. Anderson, if you'd like to file that report, we can do so once the area is cleared. Nancy looked around desperately, realizing she was losing control of both the situation and her audience. The neighbors who had once feared her now watched with open curiosity and barely concealed satisfaction. This isn't over, she hissed at me, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Not by a long shot. As the bulldozers began backing away from my driveway, Eleanor touched my arm gently. James, dear, there's something important you should know. It's about the HOA financial records. What about them? I asked quietly. Eleanor glanced around cautiously. Not here, too many years. Come by my house this evening. Bring those old property documents. I think we've only scratched the surface of what Nancy has been up to. As Nancy and Robert retreated to their waiting car, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, genuine fear in their eyes. Whatever they had been trying to hide by removing my garden so hastily, they now realized they might have awakened something much more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The last bulldozer rumbled away, leaving my tomato plants untouched in the morning sunlight. Sheriff Martinez approached with his citation book. "Want to file that report now?" I watched Nancy's car speed away, tires squealing slightly on the curve. "Absolutely. And Sheriff, you might want to contact the county prosecutor. I have a feeling this is going to involve more than just trespassing charges before we're done." Eleanor squeezed my hand, her paper-thin skin concealing surprising strength. 7 o'clock tonight, she whispered. "And James, bring a calculator. You'll need it when you see what I've found." The neighbors began to disperse, many stopping to examine my garden beds with new interest. Whatever Nancy had intended, she had inadvertently turned my modest vegetable garden into a symbol of resistance. I had simply wanted to grow tomatoes in peace. Now I was about to uncover something that would change our entire community forever. That evening, I arrived at Eleanor's charming cottage precisely at 7 o'clock. Her living room looked like it hadn't changed since 1975, doilies on the armrests, family photos covering every surface, and the faint smell of lavender hanging in the air like a memory. "I've been waiting for someone like you to move in," Eleanor said, pouring me tea from a floral pot that probably predated the neighborhood itself. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Nancy's bullying. She pulled out a weathered accordion folder from beneath her sofa. "My Frank was an accountant for the county for 42 years before he passed. He taught me how to spot when numbers don't add up." Eleanor spread dozens of papers across her coffee table. Bank statements, invoices, meeting minutes, all meticulously organized with colorful tabs and post-it notes covered in elegant handwriting. "When Nancy fined me $200 for leaving my Christmas lights up 2 days too long, I got curious about where all that money was going," she explained, her arthritic fingers tracing columns of figures. "So I started requesting public records. It's my right as a homeowner, you know." I leaned forward, examining the documents with growing amazement. "Eleanor, this is incredible. How long have you been collecting all this?" Her eyes twinkled with mischief. 3 years, just waiting for the right moment and the right person to share it with." I picked up a bank statement, my legal training immediately spotting the discrepancies. "The HOA has been collecting special assessment fees from every household for a community pool renovation that never happened." Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. "Over $300,000 has disappeared into a company called WC Holdings LLC." I turned to the last page, the LLC registration document. The managing members were listed clearly, Robert Taylor and Nancy Williams. "This is embezzlement," I whispered, the magnitude of their scheme becoming clear. "They've been stealing from the entire neighborhood." Eleanor nodded grimly. "There's more. Look at this." She handed me another folder. "They've been targeting elderly homeowners with excessive fines and violations, forcing them to sell their homes at below-market prices." I flipped through the pages, my anger growing with each document. "And then they buy the properties through shell companies and flip them for double the price." "Exactly," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "They're not just bullies, they're predators." The next morning, I called an emergency neighborhood meeting. Word spread quickly through text messages and hurried conversations across driveways, and by 7 p.m., our community center was packed with residents eager to learn what was happening. I connected my laptop to the projector and began presenting the evidence Eleanor and I had organized through the night. "These people we trusted to run our community have stolen over $300,000, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Money that was supposed to fix our pool, our roads, our playground." Gasps filled the room as I showed bank statements and transfer records detailing where the money had gone. When I revealed the systematic plan to push out elderly neighbors, angry shouts erupted from all corners of the room. "Where are Nancy and Robert now?" someone called out. "They were invited to this meeting, but chose not to come," I replied. "Their absence speaks volumes." Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge who lived on the corner, stood up, his face flushed with indignation. "I move that we vote immediately to remove the entire board and elect temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections." The vote was unanimous, 76 hands raised to dissolve the current HOA board. As neighbors lined up to sign the legal documents I'd prepared, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen showed Nancy's name. I stepped outside to take the call, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere inside. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice a toxic mixture of anger and panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think you've won because your family once owned some dirt around here." "This isn't about winning, Nancy," I replied calmly. "This is about doing what's right." "Right," she laughed, but it sounded hollow, brittle. "You don't know who you're dealing with, James. Your precious little garden is just the beginning of what I can take from you." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood in the cool evening air, wondering what she meant. What could she possibly do now that the whole neighborhood knew the truth? Back inside, people were already forming committees, one to audit all HOA finances, another to review and simplify the community rules. Eleanor sat at a table surrounded by neighbors hanging on her every word as she explained how she uncovered the scheme. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your security cameras now." I pulled up the app showing the video feed from my house. What I saw made my stomach drop. Two figures in dark clothing were at my front yard. Even in the dim light, I could make out Nancy's blonde hair and Robert's tall frame. They were pulling up my garden plants and throwing them across the lawn, their movements frenzied and desperate. I showed Sheriff Martinez, who immediately called for a patrol car to head to my house. But as we watched, Nancy looked directly at the camera, smiled, and made a slashing motion across her throat before they both got into a car and sped away. As people crowded around to see my phone screen, another text came through. "This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never planted a single seed. Can you arrest them for this?" I asked the sheriff. "Trespassing, vandalism, and with these threats, possibly more," he nodded. "But James, be careful. People who feel cornered can be dangerous." Eleanor put her frail hand on my arm. "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." As I looked around at the determined faces of my neighbors, people who had been strangers just days ago, I realized she was right. Nancy and Robert had the money and had held the power for years, but we had something stronger: the truth and each other. My phone buzzed again, another text, this time with a photo attachment. I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a picture of old documents, the very ones that proved my property's exemptions. Across the image, someone had written in red, "Originals burn so easily." That night, I barely slept, taking turns watching my security cameras and checking that my doors were locked. At 3:17 a.m., the sound of breaking glass jolted me awake. Racing downstairs, I found my kitchen window smashed and outside, my garden completely destroyed. The security footage told the story. Nancy and Robert had returned, methodically ripping up every plant and stomping on my carefully tended soil. Nancy had even poured something from a bottle onto the ground. Later tests would show it was industrial-strength herbicide, enough to ensure nothing would grow there for months. I texted Eleanor immediately, and by dawn, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Within an hour, 5 news vans had parked outside my house, reporters sensing a story that combined property rights, corruption, and the peculiarly American drama of HOA overreach. "Is it true the HOA president destroyed your property after you exposed her theft?" a reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward me as I surveyed the damage, my garden beds now resembling a war zone. By noon, 30 neighbors had shown up with plants, shovels, and determination etched on their faces. "We're with you," said Mrs. Jenkins, whom I barely knew before this week. "Nancy tried to fine me $500 for my bird feeder last month." Sheriff Martinez arrived with papers in hand. "Nancy and Robert have been arrested," he announced. "The county auditor found $300,000 missing from HOA accounts, and we have them on video destroying your property." The mood shifted from anger to celebration. The neighbors voted that day to dissolve the HOA entirely and create a new community association with limited powers and transparent finances. We wrote fair rules together, rules that encouraged individuality rather than conformity, that protected property values without sacrificing personal expression. The investigation expanded as more evidence came to light. Nancy and Robert had been running similar schemes in 2 other neighborhoods across the county. The district attorney filed charges for fraud, embezzlement, and criminal mischief. Local news covered the story for weeks, interviewing residents who had been bullied into selling their homes. "This case represents a growing problem with HOA overreach," one legal expert explained on the evening news. "What makes it unusual is that someone finally stood up and fought back." 3 months later, we held a huge community planting day. Where my destroyed garden had been, we created a neighborhood garden with plots for anyone who wanted to grow vegetables. Children who had never seen a tomato plant growing marveled at the tiny yellow flowers that would become food. Nancy and Robert both accepted plea deals rather than face trial. Part of their agreement required them to pay restitution to all the homeowners they had defrauded. Their houses were sold to cover the costs, the for sale signs standing like monuments to fallen tyrants. "You changed everything," Eleanor said, handing me the first tomato of the season, grown in the community garden we'd created together. The fruit was warm from the sun, its skin taut and red as a promise. I smiled, looking around at neighbors chatting as they watered their plots, children playing without fear of violating some arbitrary rule, and the genuine sense of community that had blossomed from the conflict. I never wanted to own the county, I said, accepting the perfectly ripe fruit. I just wanted to grow my vegetables in peace. What began as a simple dispute over a vegetable garden revealed something far more important than tomatoes or property rights. It showed us that communities aren't built by strict rules or matching mailboxes. They're created when people stand together against injustice and support each other through difficult times. Eleanor taught me that one person collecting evidence in silence can change everything when the moment is right. Sheriff Martinez showed that true authority comes with responsibility and fairness. And my neighbors demonstrated that people who might never speak to each other can become a powerful force when united by a common cause. We learned that bullies only maintain power when we remain isolated and afraid. Nancy's greatest weapon wasn't her legal connections or her position as HOA president. It was the fear she instilled in everyone around her. Once that fear disappeared, her power vanished with it. Perhaps most importantly, we discovered that fighting for what's right doesn't always mean fighting alone. Sometimes justice requires a community coming together, each person contributing what they can, whether that's legal knowledge, accounting skills, or simply the courage to stand up and say enough. In the end, we didn't just save a garden. We cultivated something much more valuable, a true neighborhood. Your home, your rights. If my story resonated with you, you're certainly not alone. Thousands of homeowners across America face similar battles with overreaching HOAs every day. I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to unreasonable rules or neighborhood bullies? What strategies worked for you? For those currently dealing with HOA disputes, remember that knowledge truly is power. I've put together a free resource guide with the top 5 documents every homeowner should keep on file to protect their property rights. The link is in the description below. If you found value in this story, please hit that like button. It helps others find this information when they need it most. And consider sharing this video with anyone you know who might be facing similar challenges in their neighborhood. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for your rights and building stronger communities. I post new content every Wednesday with practical advice for homeowners. Remember, your home is your sanctuary. No one has the right to take that peace away from you. Not even the HOA president with the perfect hair and clipboard.